Hey everyone, can you all hear me at the back? Yes? Okay, great. Thank you all so much for coming out. I think this is our first in-person event, the GW Animal Law Alumni Committee. It's really cool to see so many people here. I'm just going to briefly introduce myself, and then we'll get started with the panel. My name is Michael Cestera. I graduated in 2022, and I'm an attorney at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and one of the co-chairs of the Animal Law Alumni Committee.
I'm Laurel Palluzi. I'm a 2013 grad of GW, and I'm here working with Michael on this panel, and Joan and Kathy, and we're really excited to be here today. And I'm super excited for this turnout because this is definitely 4x of whatever I had when I was here. Turnout to any panel, external or internal, so that's fabulous. So yeah, we're really excited about the topic, and we'll introduce our panelists now. Great. Alicia, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Let's see.
I think that should be on.
Okay.
Is it? Can you hear through the microphone? Great.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It is wonderful to be here. My name is Alicia Prygoski. I am a Strategic Legislative Affairs Manager with the Animal Legal Defense Fund. I went to law school in Michigan, came out to DC. My background is in farmed animal protection specifically. I have done work at the state level and the federal level, really just trying to lobby and get legislators, members of Congress to care about farmed animals, animals in agriculture, and do what we can to implement some more protections at all levels of government.
Good afternoon, everybody. Is this one on? Yeah. Okay. I'm Christian Lovell, Senior Director of Programs at Farm Action and Farm Action Fund. I'm originally from West Central Illinois. I did spend some time out here in Washington, D.C. Had a couple different roles. Was Legislative Director to Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro during her time as Chair of the House Appropriations Committee. Since then, I have moved back home. My family has a farm. When we raise cattle, and that's where I reside today.
Great. All right, so before we get too far into the weeds asking them questions, we know that maybe not everybody in the audience, and I don't work in animal law as much as I love animals, so I personally don't know a lot about this topic. So I was hoping, Alicia, could you explain to everyone a little bit about what the EATS Act is?
I would be happy to, yes. So to start us off, it's the EATS Act. It's the Ending Agricultural Trade Suppression Act. That is the full name of it. It was introduced by Roger Marshall and Ashley Hinson in Congress. And really what this piece of legislation does, it's intended to undermine and invalidate state-level farmed animal protection laws. We can get into the wide-ranging impact that it would have. It's much broader than that, but that is really why it was introduced, specifically with regard to California's Proposition 12. I'm sure some folks in the room are very familiar with that, but the language is very peculiar. It is very vague and overbroad. So the exact language in this legislation, it undermines state laws by prohibiting a state from imposing a standard or condition on the pre-harvest production of any ag products sold in a state in interstate commerce. And so you can see it kind of has these buzzwords that don't really mean anything. We don't really know what they mean. They're not defined, and that is part of the problem with this language. Pre-harvest production, what is that? That's not defined. Standard or condition, what does that mean? And then the definition that they use for agricultural products in the bill is so vast and so vague that it essentially encompasses everything in agriculture. So you can really see how the EATS Act was intended to target Prop 12 specifically. There are issues with that in and of itself, but the language is so vague that this could just have so many unintended consequences. And to just kind of explain this using California's Proposition 12, for folks who are not familiar, that was a ballot initiative passed in California in 2018 that prohibited the sale of animal products from farmed animals raised in extreme confinement. Specifically at issue is pork from pigs raised in gestation crates. And so there's a whole history that we can get into, but just sort of the high-level, top-line view of that. California passed Proposition 12. The National Park Producers Council took issue with that because a lot of the pork sold in California comes from out of state. And so the EATS Act, you can kind of see that language, what it's doing with regard to California's Proposition 12. It would prohibit states like California from doing this in the future. And you know, it's really common for states to do this. This is not out of the ordinary. There is so much precedent for states to regulate products within their borders in this way. I mean, there are thousands of state laws where states do this, a wide variety of issues and topics. So there's a lot of precedent for this, and that is why the EATS Act is so dangerous. So I can stop there, and you know, we can just kind of keep going with some of those themes, I think.
Yeah. Christian, maybe you could help the audience a little bit in giving a brief history of how all of this also relates to the Farm Bill.
Well, sure. So I think how it relates to the Farm Bill is, you know, most legislation in that gets passed on Capitol Hill has a legislative vehicle, right? I mean, you all hear of a certain member of Congress that introduces a bill or comes up with an idea for legislation, but you know, that's really not how big legislation gets passed, right? There's either an opportunity, whether it's a funding package like what we're hearing now being negotiated on the Hill. A lot of times items are attached to bigger bills. And so what I can tell you from experience, anytime there's a bill that goes to the Ag Committee, oftentimes that committee says, well, it needs to be considered in the Farm Bill. So, you know, it was mentioned the co-sponsors of the EATS Act. You know, that bill was introduced with the strategy of them trying to attach it to the Farm Bill, as the Farm Bill would be the place for debate and consideration of legislation like this. I don't think anybody thinks that a bill like that would be considered as a standalone item. So, you know, that seems to be where this debate is happening. And we've seen both committees in House and Senate both consider language similar to the EATS Act. So that does appear that's going to be where the debate takes place.
Great. So I'll open this up to either of you. You can pick these questions as you choose. So, you know, how will the Farm Bill and the EATS Act influence existing and future state animal welfare laws, particularly those concerning the living conditions of farmed animals?
I can start if
You
you want to jump in. Okay. So California is not the only state that has passed a law like this. There are 8 states that have passed some version of this with some kind of sales ban. You know, that usually the products that we see and the animals that we see are eggs from egg-laying hens, pork from pigs, and then veal from calves. And so it is very common for states to pass, you know, on the one hand, production bans, right? That's kind of how this all started at the state level. States started passing production bans. California actually passed a production ban on egg-laying hens in 2008 before it passed Proposition 12, you know. But then the issue with that was then states were saying, okay, wait a minute, in-state producers, you know, they can't keep up with the out-of-state producers because it's an uneven playing field. So the production plus sales bans essentially level the playing field between in-state and out-of-state producers. And so anyway, there are 8 states that have done this in some form. You know, it's some of them it's only eggs from egg-laying hens. Some of them it's all 3 of those different products / species, and all of those would be invalidated should the EATS Act pass. So there are huge implications for this because a lot of those states have significant agriculture industries, for instance. And it really just sets a bad precedent for the future as well. All of the states that are interested in doing this, there's legislation in other states. Other states are interested in doing this because it makes sense for their citizens and their agriculture markets and everybody within their borders. But this would really prevent states from doing this in the future. So it would invalidate the ones that are on the books, and then it would prevent states from doing the same kind of thing. Not to mention all of the other different types of laws outside of the farm animal confinement legislation.
Yeah, and the only thing I might add to that is, and we manage a Defeat EATS coalition, and we can talk about that later. But I'll say the support for defeating EATS is really widespread, and a lot of folks don't realize there are some really hardcore conservative members of Congress and then other conservative groups that oppose the EATS Act because of what it means as far as eroding state and local control. So I think there was a really good discussion there about the implications of it. I mean, we're talking about states and localities being able to protect their communities, their people that live in those communities, and that, like was mentioned, is really unprecedented that a law would be passed preventing that from being able to occur.
Great. And in terms of that, sticking with that theme, how do you feel that different state level animal welfare regulations interact with the federal regulations around this topic, and what impact could the EATS Act have on that dynamic?
No.
Okay.
I
We can
probably
just
just need to
jump in,
mention
yeah.
this. I do not have a law degree. I will never pretend to have a law degree. But so I will yield where that is due.
Completely fair.
I think it's a nice dynamic on the panel. So I think with this one, there's kind of two separate things going on. One, just starting kind of from the baseline, you talked about state and federal regulations for farmed animals. There aren't really any federal regulations for farmed animals when it comes to animals on the farm. We have the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, we have the 28-hour law, which, not really enforced, so it's not really there. But in terms of animals being raised on the farm, there's nothing. There are no protections there. There are no welfare measures there. And so that's why it is so absolutely essential that we have those protections at the state level. Because, the Christian was alluding to this, it's really hard to get things passed at the federal level. So some kind of national standard, that is just, we're so far from that. And so having these protections at the state level is really important to make up for the lack of protection at the federal level. So that's kind of the laws, right? But then you also get into this dynamic with federalism and states' rights and the interplay there. And the EATS Act, basic 10th Amendment, right? All powers not designated to the federal government are reserved for the states. Well, this is a serious federal overreach because it would strip away so much power from state and local governments and take it back to the federal government in such a way that, I think there is a really decent argument that it would be unconstitutional.
So speaking of those states, could you give some examples of state laws that could be invalidated or practices that states have been following today that if the EATS Act were to go into effect, that would change overnight?
Yeah, do you want to take that one?
I can. I'm not going to be able to give you anything specific, but we have had people look into this, and the EATS Act, as it's currently written, it was mentioned how broad it is and the implications of that broad language. It's very basic protections that state and localities have adopted. I'll give you one example, and it involves firewood, right? So there's different organisms and insects that can infect trees, and there's different kinds. Those spread geographically across the United States. Different states have adopted different regulations around the trafficking of firewood. Sometimes, especially if you're in an affected area, you might see kind of a promotional campaign of buy local firewood, right? Because if you're trucking in firewood from another state, you're trucking in the firewood from another state, you might be trucking in the bugs from another state. So that's an example of that's the kind of protections where when we're talking about these products that are moving throughout the country, that's a law that would be impacted by this. Other things that states do to protect environmental concerns. That's why in our coalition, we've got different environmental groups. We've got several environmental groups. We've got one that's on our steering committee. We've also got an ASPCA that's on our steering committee. Chelsea's here. Give a shout out to that. It's because there's such a community that would be impacted by this legislation that because of how it's written, that really would cause a lot of concern for how states regulate their communities.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add too, I think that I have to give a shout out to the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program. If you haven't seen the report that they did, I highly encourage folks to look it up because they started doing this actually all the way back before this was the Eats Act, when it was the King Amendment. This kind of language has been around for just about 10 years now. But anyway, so the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program actually compiled thousands of state laws that would be invalidated by then the King Amendment, now the Eats Act. They did an updated report. The Eats Act language is narrower, so it is fewer laws, but it's still over 1,000 state and local laws that would be invalidated by this language. And like Christian was saying, firewood regulations, right? Like this is not just about animals. This is about, such a wide range of state laws. You have animal protection laws, you have laws like the firewood regulations that would invalidate regulations keeping invasive pests, invasive plants out that affect biodiversity. You have laws intended to protect against the transport of zoonotic disease, which is a huge issue, especially right now with avian flu raging across the country. The list literally just goes on and on and on. And thankfully, the folks at Harvard have kind of compiled it for us. But it is so wide ranging, and that's part of the reason that this is really concerning.
So you mentioned the zoonotic diseases, so I'll bring that one up. But
Sure.
What implications would the Eats Act have for controlling zoonotic disease transmission from state to state?
Mm-hmm. So that is a really big issue. When it comes to animals used in agriculture, but then also when it comes to wild animals as well. So animals used in agriculture, I referenced the current outbreak of avian flu. This has been going on for years now. It's really concerning. It keeps hitting farms with birds, with poultry, but it's also, now we're seeing it in cows, and it's transmitted from cows to humans in a few select cases. And we all know, right? We all know from COVID what can happen when a zoonotic disease jumps to humans. So the risk for animals is huge, the risk for humans is huge, and a lot of states try to prevent this by having certain regulations, import regulations, making sure that, say, any cows coming into a state are checked for certain types of diseases. That would be avian flu, same kind of thing. Any birds coming into the state are checked, and it's documented. Everything is documented to ensure that we're not bringing those zoonotic diseases across state lines. But you can see how, going back to the beginning with the Eats Act language, how that language, the birds were produced in a different state and they're being brought into another state. And so it could invalidate things like that. Another one that is really concerning is chronic wasting disease, disease specifically for deer, things like that, our wildlife. So if folks are trying to bring wildlife in to a state, this could also effectively decimate wildlife populations too. And so the zoonotic disease angle of this is so important. It's so concerning. And again, the Eats Act it just shows the unintended consequences of something like this, because the Eats Act is intended to invalidate Proposition 12, but there are so many other ways that this could be harmful.
And so how might this impact consumers' ability to make informed choices, just generally, but also in the animal welfare context when purchasing animal products?
Well, I think consumers obviously make the best decisions for themselves when they have full information. And in this case, I think that it includes information about how their food is raised and processed, etc. Kind of going back to the original Prop 12, that was overwhelmingly passed. That was not like a razor thin margin or anything like that. It was overwhelmingly, and I think it's no surprise. I think consumers do care where their food comes from. I think they do care how it is raised, and I do think that they care about the consequences of the animals that are involved or the environmental toll on how food is produced. But I also think we've seen at the same time some of the corporations that control our food system. It's almost like they want to hang a veil over that. They don't want the consumer to see anything until it gets to the grocery store shelves, and that's because those corporations have rigged a food system that is extractive to rural communities like the ones I I grew up in and now live in. And they exploit natural resources. They exploit the animals really for their own profit and their own gain. I mean, that's just the long and the short of it. You know, I'm a part of a state-based ag group back home in Illinois, and we just recently had an event a couple weekends ago, and the host farm, the farmer there said, you know, the farm needs to be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. And that's the reality is, as farmers, as food producers, we should be proud of the system that we're putting forward. And I can tell you right now, as I drive across CAFOs, or I drive across feedlots, or I look at some of the slaughterhouses that exist and the exploitation of animals that exist, the exploitation of workers in those facilities, I'm not necessarily proud of that. And I think just overall, this legislation, if passed, would allow that veil, it almost cement it, you know, in a way that prevents consumers from getting at, being able to see some of these things, and because it's going to take being able to see them to then reform it.
And what incentives do you think, or what can we do? Like, what can the ordinary citizen do to prevent this? Like, is there anything, any calls to action, anything that, people can do?
I'll go ahead and highlight our coalition. So I mentioned it earlier. We've got the Defeat Eats Coalition. It's well over 100, probably pushing 150 advocacy organizations representing all over the United States. It's like anything when Congress is considering a piece of legislation, all politics is local, and people need to weigh in with their members. I can tell you, I worked on Capitol Hill for several years. Oftentimes, food and agriculture issues they're not on the top level, right? I can promise you they don't, those members do not walk in their office and think, oh, what's going on in ag policy today? It's not what gets it, That's not what's on TV, it's not what gets votes, it's not, and so oftentimes and I've said this before, we talked about the Farm Bill. Oftentimes when Congress has considered the Farm Bill before, the Farm Bill includes two major policy areas. I mean, there's a whole host of different titles, but you can basically divide it into two. The first is farm policy, production policy, and the second is nutrition programs, food assistance. Time and time again over the years, Republicans get to work on the farm policy, Democrats work on the nutrition assistance policy, and as soon as they get that ironed out, then they can pass a bill. And the unfortunate part about that is that both parties seem to ignore the other side. Republicans have done a better job in recent years of messing with the nutrition side, but I think being able to show members why this is important, why they should care about this. I mean, this is a production ag issue, right? And historically, like we said, members don't necessarily pay attention to that. It's being able to demonstrate to them why that is important. And it's because it is important to the consumer, their families and communities. And that's what we've tried to do with our coalition. Like I said, a really diverse group. We've put together different advocacy toolkits for them to help them weigh in, whether that's directly with a member, whether it's doing different events and different advocacy like op-eds or letters to the editor. Because the more we can demonstrate locally why this is an issue, that's how you get members' attention.
Yeah, and I would just add, we're big fans of the Defeat Eats Coalition. We are a member of that at Animal Legal Defense Fund. And I just couldn't agree more about the coalition work. It's so important, right? Because if you're coming to an office as one organization or one issue area, I mean, that's great, but that might not resonate with that particular member. And so having that coalition that represents diverse interests and diverse backgrounds and people, I think that's really powerful. And you know, I will say this issue too is really interesting because we do have this dynamic where we have the EATS Act, but then we also have this language that's in the House version of the Farm Bill. And so it is kind of the dynamic with advocacy can get a little strange because it's like, okay, well, what am I doing? Am I going to the office and saying, hey, oppose the EATS Act or oppose this language in the Farm Bill? And I think that it's important for all of it to be part of the conversation. You know, I do think that, as Christian noted, the true risk here is the Farm Bill. I mean, you know, the EATS Act as a standalone bill, it's not really going anywhere. But it's important to have that conversation and to get to know the Farm Bill, get to understand it, because it is a massive, confusing piece of legislation with so many different thousands of issues, right? And so really just kind of having that understanding of the Farm Bill and the process and the way it works, and the fact that members can insert a section in there that is essentially the EATS Act. You know, it's interesting. I mean, the language in the Farm Bill in the House version is a little bit different than the EATS Act, but it would achieve the same thing. And so really just kind of understanding that dynamic too before reaching out to members, before calling an office, before trying to set up a meeting with a staffer. I think that is a really good thing to do and really important as well.
So with regards to both pieces of legislation, is there anything in the draft Farm Bill or in the EATS Act that actually addresses the consumer demand for transparency? You know, we can say transparency generally in the food production industry, but also, you know, specifically given this is an animal law program, saying, you know, with animal welfare concerns. Is there any aspect of that that is addressing what consumers are looking for? Because I think there's been an ongoing, you know, demand from the public for more transparency in where their food comes from, how it's being processed, all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, you know, I think with regard to the EATS Act, that is sort of the problem, right? The EATS Act would not do anything good related to transparency. It would do the complete opposite. It would take transparency away from consumers. And you know, what I'll add to my knowledge of the Farm Bill in this particular area, the transparency area, is not that in-depth. Perhaps yours is, but I will say that is a big issue. That is a big issue. Transparency, labeling, these are all things that organizations like ours are working to try and get into the Farm Bill. Greater transparency surrounding food ingredients, ways animals were raised. That is something that we do work on all the time. You know, that has to constantly be part of the discussion, because does cage-free really mean cage-free? You know, all of those terms, so many terms. What does free range mean? And so it should be part of the discussion with the Farm Bill, and we do try to make that so.
Yeah, and I guess I'll say, you know, explicitly in the Farm Bill, I'm not aware of anything now, you know, that's explicitly doing that. I will say, you know, obviously we have the National Organic Program, and there are certain standards underneath organic. Some of those standards have been better or worse in recent times. I mean, there is a welfare standard. You know, I'll also say I think this current administration has done a very good job on the labeling front. You know, I talked a minute ago about consumers making the best choices when they're fully informed. Well, the label is the most important, you know, way to get information on a food product when you go to buy that. And we've seen this administration take steps to ensure labeling integrity. And at Farm Action, we have a truth in labeling campaign. I'll give you one example. The use of no antibiotics on a label, right? That's something that we've really been appreciative of the Department of Agriculture. I mean, they recently came out and said that they're going to do testing for companies that are using that label, and there's a lot of companies that said, "Oh, okay, we'll no longer use the label then." It's like, okay, so you know, there's efforts like that. You know, just to give you an example, there's a product of USA labeling. You know, there's country of origin labeling, which is a little bit different. Product of USA labeling it's a label that was used as a loophole, and basically the regulations were so lax that as long as a meat product, was somehow processed in a U.S. facility, you could slap on the product of USA label. So you know, that included you could import meat from overseas, where we have no, you talk about transparency, we have no idea how it's being produced over there. One of my favorite is there's some South American countries that are cutting down the rainforest to raise beef down there in a very unsustainable way and then ship it up here at a lower cost and negatively impact American cattle producers. But that beef can come into the U.S. as long as it's repackaged in a U.S. Facility. It can have that product the USA label. Well, I mean, and I would encourage you. You can go in the meat counter in your grocery store, and you can look for the product the USA label, and that But what does that actually mean? Well, we've seen, and I can tell you, I believe it was 2017, might have been 2018. I was in a meeting with the head of what is USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service under the Trump administration, and I brought up this particular issue with her in person, and she said, "Oh, no one uses that anyway. Those meat corporations don't use that. It's really a non-issue." Well, okay. Fast forward to today, the Biden administration put out the rule, and they're updating the product to U.S. There's an implementation period for compliance. So why did those corporations need a compliance period if I was told, a handful of years ago that no one was using it? So the reality is these corporations do take advantage of the system. They do take advantage of consumers, and that's really underscores why added transparency is always important.
And thinking about sort of the ethical considerations and all of this, can you elaborate on those that lawmakers should consider when drafting legislation that affects animal welfare and agriculture? What ethical considerations and, things like labeling and whether consumers are aware of all of that, right? What should they consider when drafting these laws and revising them?
I mean, I think that there are ethical considerations on a number of different issues, right? You have the animal welfare impact. How are you raising your animals? Are you raising your animals in a more sustainable way? Are you raising your animals in a CAFO, in crates and cages so small that they can't move? There's the ethical consideration with consumers, like we were just talking about. People deserve to know what they are eating and how that was, how the animal products, how the animals were raised. There's also just the general public health and safety issue. We see things like food recalls, we see things like animal disease outbreaks, particularly with CAFOs, because they pack the animals so densely together that it is way more likely that something like avian flu is going to spread rapidly through one of those facilities. There's the ethical considerations with regard to the environment, the air pollution, the water pollution from raising animals at such an unsustainable, massive scale, and of course surrounding communities. There's an environmental justice aspect to this. There are so many different ways and ways that you would have to look at the ethical considerations, because something like intensive factory farming does affect really everything around it. We're entrenched in this system, unfortunately, in the United States, where it is completely unsustainable, and we're seeing that. And so, trying to take steps to transition to a type of farming that is more sustainable, I mean, that's what a lot of our organizations are working to do. But unfortunately, there are so many massive conglomerates that it is a really hard step to take. And I have to just mention another ethical consideration with regard to the EATS Act specifically, because this is an interesting one. So Christian mentioned that Prop 12, and I realize I'm veering off here a little bit, but Prop 12 passed at the ballot by massive numbers, right? I think it was 62% of the vote. Massachusetts Question 3 passed by 78% of the vote. So, that is a huge margin. And that is the people of those states speaking out and saying, we want this. Those are citizens of those states saying, this is important for my state, we want this here. That is such a clear message, right, with those particular numbers. And so then for members of Congress to essentially step in, introduce legislation to take that away from the states, I mean, it really is undermining democracy. So I just think that that's an important piece of the discussion when you were talking about the EATS Act as well.
Well, The thing I want to add, kind of when we think about ethics, and this is just my perspective, but ethics in crafting legislation, right? How many people in here have worked on Capitol Hill, or I know Chelsea has, I mean, anybody, okay, so those folks are so busy, and a lot of times they're busy with stuff that doesn't have to do with actually legislating, but there's some other things they do, either get on TV or make phone calls and try to make money and raise money. But I will say, at least from my perspective, and I don't want to distract from, there are some very serious legislators up there. I was very fortunate enough to be able to work for one. But I oftentimes found myself thinking, this is a little bit of a lazy way of doing business. And I can speak a little bit more freely these days. But because what I mean by that is you have the lobbyist that represent some of these big organizations, these big corporations. They'll do everything for you. They'll write the bill for you. They'll write your hearing questions for you. And you can just use it, And as a staffer, that's kind of great, right? I mean, you're going to write my boss's hearing questions for me. I'll just submit them as is. There's no plagiarism involved there, right? Your lobbyist just gives you the questions, and you can just take it and run with it. But that there can be a flaw in that system, and there can be a flaw in that system when there's not much critical thinking in terms of, well, wait a minute, who's asking for this? Why are they asking for this? And not thinking of we talk oftentimes in legislation and policy, we talk about unintended consequences. What has been the unintended consequence of the food system that we have today? I'll give you an example. So my grandparents' farm is in almost smack dab in the middle of a very tiny, it's not even really a town anymore. Back in the day, it used to actually be a vibrant town. We can talk about the erosion of rural America another time. But smack dab in the middle of this tiny little town that's not even a town anymore. There's a state highway that runs to the west of my grandparents' property, and then on the other side of that, there was a farm ground. It can't be more than 80 acres there. It was up for auction. That's how we sell farm ground most of the time, is public auction. It was up for auction about a year ago, I think, a year and a half ago. And the prevailing rumor at the time, leading up, in the weeks leading up to the auction, was that it was going to be bought, and they were going to put a swine CAFO on that property, which was due west of my grandparents' house. I've never seen my grandma look so worried and frightened, because you do not want to live next to a CAFO. It's fine when it's down the road several miles, but you don't want one right next to your house. And so, anyway, I just say that goes back to the system we have now is unethical. And the CAFO didn't get built, but it did cause some concern there for a little bit.
No, but I think this is a good segue. So, the assumption is, of course, that these CAFOs and things are built because there's economics in that, and they can save money by doing that. So, how do economic pressures on farmers, how do we fix that so they can maximize production, but we can improve animal welfare? What role should these bills play in incentivizing, essentially, farmers to do the right ethical thing by the animals? Take that one.
Well, I'll touch on that economic piece to begin with. When you look at where the system has gone, the model is actually pretty clear. From the minute, and it doesn't matter whether you're raising piglets or whether you're growing corn or whatever, that whole supply chain from start to finish, when these mega conglomerates that really rule our food system. I mean, not to keep plugging Farm Action's work, but we just put out an ag data consolidation hub. I mean, you really encourage everybody in this room to go look at it. You know, we always hear about, you know, ag is consolidated and our food's consolidated. We actually compiled the data and put it all out in one place. You know, I mean, there's just a handful of corporations that control what we're talking about. They look at that system, and every point along that system represents a cost. And if you remember, you know, everyone in here has probably taken economics courses. When you're trying to maximize profit, right, you can either, you know, and you're also minimizing your costs, right? And so as a corporation, they're looking at each one of those as a way to minimize a cost. And so, so I just say that whole mentality has gone unchecked for so long that you get the system like we have today. You get animals that are exploited. You get the overuse of antibiotics, and you know, it still happens. I mean, FDA has tried their best with new guidance and whatever. It still happens. You know, you get a system where rivers and streams that a generation ago, a grandfather took his son out and they went fishing in that river, and now you can't even hardly get near the river, let alone try to eat a fish out of it. You know, so the toll on the environment, you know, the toll on the farmer themselves and those rural communities. I mean, to their credit, these corporations have done a really, really good job of maximizing the entire system for themselves, but we can see where the expenses have been. So, you know, you mentioned how do you incentivize the farmer outside of that. You know, there's a lot of ideas. There's you know, a lot of really good policy measures that are being you know pushed forward and brought forward. But I can tell you what has occurred in California, right? There's been a market that's been created there for people that are essentially raising high, you know, what could be called high welfare pork, or and I mean, Farm Action, we organized a letter, I believe about a year ago at this point, where we had those producers write a letter to Congress and say, you know, hey, you're taking away a market opportunity from us. I mean, California consumers want high welfare pork. They voted for it, they passed it, they've implemented it. Then we have groups of farmers that are rising up to meet that need, and now Congress through the EATS Act would take that away from them. I mean, that's not American. That doesn't feel American. And so I think from the farmer perspective, you know, the farmer will meet consumer demand, and the farmer can raise livestock or any crop or anything in a very sustainable way, but the market has to be there. And when you have corporations that have rigged the system and rigged the markets in a way that they've been unchecked for the last several decades to be able to do that, there's not, at that point, there's not much the farmer can do.
I would just add, I mean, that was a fantastic explanation, you know, but I would just add too, I think something that all of us can do is to try and keep track of where those federal dollars are going. You know, are federal dollars going to plant-based producers and higher welfare producers? Are our federal dollars going to massive conglomerates that are destroying the environment and harming animals? Because the reality, unfortunately, is that a lot of them are. There's so much funding flowing to these massive corporations to continue to entrench us in this unsustainable system, that, you know, we need to constantly be advocating for the federal funding to go elsewhere to more sustainable types of farming.
So how can policymakers ensure that animal welfare is not sidelined in favor of economic interests in the agricultural sector?
I mean, I think it really takes some champions, you know, and one, I would say it takes education and advocacy, right? So we all have a part to play in that too. There are some fantastic members of Congress, there are some fantastic state legislators who really care about these issues and who do see it the right way, so to speak. I mean, you know, when thinking of Congress, my mind goes immediately to Cory Booker. Senator Booker is amazing on these issues. There are folks like that out there who have to continue to highlight this because there are so many issues that Congress is discussing. I mean, it is so true. This just isn't one of the priorities that is going to come to mind every single day. And so, you know, it's kind of up to those folks to put it on the agenda, to push for it, to continue to make it part of the discussion. But oftentimes they're only going to do that if their constituents are also highlighting it and making it known that, hey, the people who are electing you and putting you in this seat in Congress care about this. So that's where it really comes down to all of us. You know, it's kind of just like this chain, right, where we have to be reaching out. We have to be involved and talking to staffers and our legislators to let them know that this is important to their constituency, because if it's important to their constituency, then it will also become, hopefully, you know, most of the time, right, it'll become important to them as well. So I think it's this balance of advocacy and education and outreach and finding the legislators who truly care about getting us to a place where we are being better to animals, better to the environment, better to rural communities and smaller farmers.
And the number one thing they can do in the short term is keep the legislation we've been talking about today out of the next farm bill.
Great.
Absolutely.
So speaking of the next farm bill, is there anything in the draft of the next farm bill that supports research into an adoption of farming practices that enhance animal welfare? Is there anything that you're aware of in that draft bill?
That is a tricky one. It's unfortunately we're not really seeing much of that. You know, there are, when it comes to animal welfare, I mean, it looks like Chelsea wants to say something.
The Senate, the transition funding in the Senate.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, please don't neglect it, but yes, go on.
Chelsea, would you like the microphone for a second?
No, I don't deserve a microphone. We don't have draft Senate language, but we should all be shouting from the rooftops that the outline that the Democrats in the Senate have proposed includes funding for farmers to stop factory farming and switch to other modes of production. That's like such an enormous win, I can't even fathom it, and everyone should fight to keep it in the final law. I'm so sorry to hijack this, but please.
I'm so glad that you did. I'm so glad that you did, because I mean, my mind immediately goes to the House draft, you know, and what's out there right now, because
Yes.
there's no Senate draft. But I mean, Chelsea's right. Like that is, the Senate is a little bit better on this. The draft that's out there right now is on the rougher side of things, but you know, I think that we do have a reason to be hopeful that when they do come out with that, we're gonna see some more stuff that we like. There are also, you know, aside from the animals in agriculture and farmed animal world, I mean, the Farm Bill covers so many other topics. Like one thing that we work on a lot is roadside zoos, puppy mills, Animal Welfare Act facilities, because that all falls under USDA, and so that falls under the Farm Bill. And so there are some positive provisions on that as well, you know, just smaller scale things. But I think that when looking at the Farm Bill, it is helpful to remember that it's not just animals in agriculture. The USDA is so expansive. It covers so many animal issues. And so I think that, you know, we really try to go for those smaller wins where we can, and work incrementally where we can.
Well, and the only thing I'll add to that is, and Chelsea's right, you know, that's really a historic program, and if it comes to fruition, hopefully will be kind of like a turning point, because you know, agriculture today doesn't look much like when my grandfather was on the farm. And what I mean by that is you almost think today there's only one way of doing things. I mean, if you want to raise pigs, this is how you raise them. If you want to raise cattle, this is how you raise them. If you want to grow corn, this is how you raise them. Probably need to diversify I think, you know, down south they have cotton. If you want to raise cotton, this is how you know, they also have peanuts down there, but I'm from the Midwest, so I'll stick with what I know.
There's a lot of corn out
You
there.
know, yeah, I mean, you know, it's a cookie cutter system. And it doesn't matter whether you're growing corn in my county or whether you're growing corn on the opposite side of the state. I live in Illinois. It's essentially the same production system. And I guess I think something we need to pursue into the future is diversifying production systems, and I think when you think about whether you want to call it regenerative agriculture, whether you want to call it sustainable agriculture, that does create opportunity, that does create diversity, and that is a good thing, not only for our food system, but for the people in agriculture or young people that want to get into agriculture, want to get into growing food. That's really important. Now, I can't take credit for this because this is not my analogy, but someone I know that grew up in Iowa, we think about Iowa, Illinois, all of these places as the breadbasket, of America, the heartland. Well, the reality is, in terms of the food we actually eat, here in this city, and in fact, probably right down the street, I could probably get a fresher, healthier, more locally sourced meal than I can back in my hometown. I mean, has anybody ever heard of Casey's General Store, Casey's gas station? I mean, we have Casey's Pizza, which ain't very good, but you know what I mean? So, and so you think about these communities, these rural communities like the one I live in that are supposed to be these, like, that's where we grow our food. And it's like, well, we're not really growing anything anybody actually eats. And so I think, and what I hope long-term, the program that, Chelsea mentioned, somebody that's stuck in a very low vibrational system of, I've got this concrete building with thousands of pigs in it that smells, and the pigs aren't very healthy, and I'm pulling dead pigs out of it every day, and I'm slapping them with antibiotics. Someone can say, wow, I don't have to do this, and somebody's going to help me find a better system. Because what I want those people to do, instead of getting trapped on that, little kind of hamster wheel of corporate ag that you're just their pawn, I want that person to be able to wake up one day and say, wait, I can grow food in a very sustainable, if not regenerative way for my community, and I can create a good living doing that, and I can positively impact the environment doing that, and I can positively impact the animals and everything else. And I think when we get to that sort of system, I think that's when we will get back to rural communities being vibrant and being good places to live.
That's great. I was gonna say, you keep seeing corn, but soybeans.
Illinois is the number
other
one soybean state. Same principle with them. They're grown the same way. Trust me, I've seen a lot of them.
Yeah, I was saying, if it's not corn, it's soybeans, and then they reverse it the next year. Sorry, we're all Midwest, it seems.
Actually, yeah.
Anyway, all right. So I think we've been going for almost an hour, so let's sort of end here. I think what are some of the political implications legislators must think through when deciding whether to support or oppose the EATS Act? And I know we've kind of been talking about that, but sort of any final parting thoughts that you all have, I think would be great.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I would go back to two things. One is those ethics that we were talking about. This is an unethical bill. It is a concerning bill. It is downright dangerous. It sets a horrible precedent and takes so much power away from the states. So really thinking through that and thinking through those implications. I mean, there's a reason that there is bipartisan opposition to this. There's a reason that so many different folks representing different issue areas, right? Small farmers, environmental groups, animal groups, public health and safety, such a wide variety of people are opposing this. So I think that is something too. So really the ethical considerations, and then I just keep coming back to constituents. They are going to be, to some extent, they're going to be influenced by their constituents. So, they have to think through what's best for my constituents, and the way that we can all help impact that is by being those constituents, by reaching out, by working with folks who are constituents in important districts, who have members of Congress who are particularly influential, and really just continuing to hammer this message, because that is something that, you know, hopefully they will pay attention to and they will care about.
Well, I will underscore that the politics of this is real. I'm not gonna name names, but there are certain, you know, members of Congress that on paper you'd think, well, they should actually be for, you know, on our side, you know what we're talking about. And then you know, they're not, and there's a reason for that. You know, one thing kind of in thinking about that, what always really, I was always disappointed in is when I was a congressional staffer is the term farmer became almost a very homogenous term, right? And so it was, well, what do the farmers think, or what do the farmers want? And farmer is not a homogenous term, and you know, that to me, kind of going back to that lazy way of doing business. If you're so I think if you went to Capitol Hill, I think the prevailing theory is that, oh, farmers are against farmers are against what we're trying to talk about here, right? Like the farmers actually want EATS Act passed, and you know, agriculture wants this, and I would just really encourage anybody like that to not think of farmer as homogenous, and really separate what is good for ag business and what is good for ag corporations from what is good for the farmer and the rural community. Because I think what the agriculture industry, what the agricultural lobby has done a really good job of is merging the two, and convincing people that's what's good for a multinational, you know, billion-dollar corporation is also what's good for the farmer, and that they have the same voice, and that you don't need to seek out their voice, just take our voice. And that dynamic is playing out, and it is a really big factor.
Great. Well, thank you both for your time and educating everyone on this. I think it's been great. So the next hour is going to be a networking hour. We did want to take like a few minutes, let people, if they need to use the facilities or anything, or we have plenty of vegan tasties in the back. If you came in late and didn't see those, please help yourself if you haven't already. Otherwise, what we're hoping to do is just take a brief survey hands of how many of you are students? Great. And how many of you are not associated with the law school in any way, meaning you don't work here? Okay, great. So, perfect. So what I'm hoping to do is that we put one person at every table who is not a student or does not work at the law school, and then students can come sit down, and we'll sort of have the people who don't work at the law school or aren't students just stay where they are, and then the students and others can sort of just get up and switch tables, and we'll do that every 10 to 15 minutes. We'll figure out how conversation's going, to how many switches we do that 2 or 3 times. So it is about 5:09 on my watch, so we'll get started in like 3 minutes at 5:12. Does that work for everyone? Great.
Thank you.